The War of 1812. Round 2 of the American Revolutionary War, and one of the most pointless wars in American history, due to the fact that really neither side won or lost the war. No territorial changes were made, and the only real losers were the Native Americans. The war was utterly pointless. However, had there been a winner of the war, it may in fact be different, and it may have actually been a meaningful war. For starters, it was viewed as a draw even though the British had burned down the White House. It was seen as an American victory by America because of the fact that at the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson essentially destroyed the British, even though he was heavily outnumbered. And due to this, it gave America the perception that because of Jackson's victory at New Orleans, the British were forced to negotiate. This is, however, not the case, and the Battle of New Orleans actually took place 15 days after the Treaty of Ghent, which had assured peace, had already been made. But that's besides the point. An American victory in this war would greatly change how the United States is today, for territorial reasons as well as sort of cultural reasons as well. For starters, Canada would be completely different today. At the time, Canada was controlled by the British and was heavily populated by loyalists, or people in the American Revolutionary War who were colonists but sided with the British. Many of them fled to Canada after the American Revolutionary War had ended because of their loyalty to the British, and Canada was still a British territory after the end of the Revolutionary War. Even though today there is talk, well, when I mean talk, I mean it's not serious, but there's sort of this whole idea that the United States should invade Canada. Well, that has actually happened, I think, twice. Once during the Revolution and once during the War of 1812. In the case where Canada gets annexed by the United States, this is what the United States' map would look like. It would have all of these Canadian territories incorporated into the United States. Of course, Canada would not willingly assimilate into the United States. Many of them were in fact British loyalists, and they would probably rebel or try to resist becoming American citizens. The only people who would be opposed to annexing Canada would be the old Republicans, such as John Randolph, who were completely opposed to territorial expansion or any form or anything which they viewed as a federalist idea. Now, the Federalists believed in westward expansion, industrial improvement, internal improvements, and a more centralized federal government. John Randolph and the old Republicans would have completely opposed this, as well as a plan to annex Canada, which was heavily, in fact, British and French when it came down to culture. So there would, in fact, be opposition to a plan to annex Canada into the United States. However, at the end of the day, most Americans would agree with this idea that Canada should become part of the United States, even though Canada would not like it. Needless to say, after the War of 1812, America would still usher in the era of good feelings, and there would be no political parties at this time, and the Federalist Party would in fact be utterly destroyed. They wouldn't even actually mount a candidate in 1816. Now, technically, James Monroe was definitely going to win the 1816 election, no doubt about it, no matter what scenario we're talking about. But at the same time, the Federalists probably would have just completely collapsed by 1816 because they were the ones opposed to the war, and since America had actually won the war instead of merely a draw, they wouldn't have even bothered to nominate a candidate. America probably would have bought Florida much earlier in the scenario, and it's also because of the fact that many in the South had wanted more slave states to counter the free states with Canada. Now, the Missouri Compromise line would probably be moved more north than it actually was. Instead of the 3630 parallel, the Missouri Compromise line may actually be at the top of Missouri instead of at the bottom, as an attempt to more fairly divide the free and slave states, because pretty much every state which would become part of Canada, while every Canadian state which would become part of the United States, would essentially be a free state, no doubt about it. So there would, of course, however, the South would still need more slave states in order to balance the number of Senate seats they had. So most likely the battle that would have decided the war between the United States and the British, the War of 1812. The battle that would have decided this would probably be the Battle of Queenston Heights, in which the Americans would lost to the British in our actual scenario, even though they outnumbered the British in this battle. However, let's just say America had won the Battle of Queenston Heights in this new scenario. That would probably be the cause of a British surrender in the War of 1812. Now, one of the candidate for president in the 1824 election would probably be Stephen Van Rensselaer. Stephen Van Rensselaer would be the candidate for president in 1824. Now, you may not even know who this guy is, but he was the military general on the American side during the Battle of Queenston Heights. And in this case, since it's an American victory, he would become much more popular, and he would be credited with the American victory in the War of 1812. And this guy was actually involved in politics before he was a general. So it's not unlikely that he would run for president and in fact win the presidency. He would sort of be like the Andrew Jackson of this scenario. And keep in mind, in this scenario, Andrew Jackson would never receive the fame he has to become president, given the fact that the Battle of New Orleans would never have even happened. Now, to balance the ticket, he would probably pick John C. Calhoun as his running mate, just so that the Southerners wouldn't be angry, considering the fact that Van Rensselaer was opposed to slavery and actually supported many Federalist policies and was a Federalist before the Federalist Party collapsed. William Crawford and the old Republicans would probably oppose Van Rensselaer as president. However, they would still not be able to stop him. But Van Rensselaer would definitely deter to John Quincy Adams, who would be his Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams would really be more so of the power behind the throne and would influence many of his decisions. In fact, Adams's more ambitious policies, such as the creation of a naval academy or the first bankruptcy law, would most likely be passed in this scenario because Van Rensselaer would not have got the same amount of opposition that Adams had, because his election would not have been as controversial, as well as the fact that Van Rensselaer was a military general and would most likely be much more popular with the American public. Also, America would have likely contributed to the Congress of Panama, in which was basically a Congress with all of the Latin American and North American countries. All of them got involved. So most likely in this scenario, America would have gotten involved in the Congress of Panama. The Tariff of Abominations would still have been passed under a Van Rensselaer presidency. Van Rensselaer was in fact a Federalist, and he would definitely support the high tariff rates of the Tariff of 1828. Now, let's get back to Canada for a minute. So Canadians, as I said earlier, would have been heavily opposed to annexation by the United States, but inevitably, sooner or later, a few of the Canadian states would be forced to apply to statehood. This may happen very late, like in the 1840s or 1850s, in fact, because many of them would be in rebellion, and the United States would have to focus a large portion of its military in making sure that the Canadians don't rebel. However, this would directly affect the issue of slavery, because if the formerly British areas in Canada applied to statehood, then that would disturb the balance between free and slave states, and the South would be heavily opposed to including the Canadian statehood. However, at the same time, they would be willing to offer Canada statehood on the condition that they would also get their own states. This would come through Mexico. Spain at this time would most likely be struggling to keep Mexico under its control, and like I said, this would occur during the 1830s, so the Spanish would most likely sell Mexico to the United States for somewhere around $20 million or something, and they probably wouldn't sell their islands in the Caribbean, but Mexico itself would, in fact, be beneficial to the United States. Now, some Americans would oppose adding Mexico to the United States off of the grounds that, yes, they did not want to assimilate Mexicans into America, and they did not want to have to take care of them. So it's likely that there would be segregational laws in Mexico that would prevent many Mexican Americans from becoming American citizens, and there could even have been installed slavery in Mexico with both African Americans and Mexicans, too. Now, it would take a while for the Mexican states to actually become states. Same with Canada. So the process of Mexican statehood and Canadian statehood would take a very long time. It's likely that Mexico and Canada would be divided into roughly 7 or 8 or even like 10 states, and then they would become states in the United States. Another change would be the state of California. In this scenario, since California is below that line, which is in northern Missouri, California would become a slave state instead of a free state. And in this scenario, in fact, since California would be a slave state, it's possible the Compromise of 1850 would have never happened because all of the areas in the Southwest, which were gained from the Mexican-American War, which would never even happen in this scenario, all of those areas are now definitely slave states since they're below the new compromise line. It's possible, in fact, that the South would have even wanted to gain the Caribbean islands and even parts of South America and to expand even further down. However, Northerners would be vehemently opposed to this because they wouldn't want to cause any more wars and they didn't want to expand slavery any more than they should. The Civil War would still happen and would probably be even more destructive and long than ever, perhaps even becoming a 10-year conflict because of how much territory the United States would have acquired. It's possible that the South could have also fought a war with Spain to gain Cuba in this scenario, given how long the war would have been. Now, if the South did actually succeed in gaining Cuba and the Caribbean islands from Spain, it is possible that the actual definition of Manifest Destiny, which was to gain control of the entire North American continent, would have come true in this scenario. And we would see a united North American continent all under the control of the United States once the United States purchases Alaska from the Russians. They would control everything. Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean, and perhaps even parts of South America. It's possible. So, anyway, this new scenario in which the United States wins the War of 1812 would greatly change how the world is today, especially the United States, as well as the North American continent. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel.